Good afternoon, everybody. I didn't expect to hear from the people online in response, but the people who are here in person, good afternoon. Thank you. Just making sure you're awake. Thank you for joining us. My name is Daniel Horan, and I'm professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology, and I have the privilege of serving as the director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality here at St. Mary's College. I'm delighted to welcome you to this lecture, but before introducing our guest, I'd like to take a moment to say a word about the center. Founded in 1984 by Dr. Keith Egan with the financial support of the Sisters of the Holy Cross, the Center for the Study of Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. As an academic center, it is a hub for scholarly and public engagement, which draws on intellectual resources in the Catholic and broader Christian tradition, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. Before we proceed with our event, we wish to acknowledge that we are gathering on sacred land and to honor the Native peoples who have been the traditional custodians of this place for generations. We particularly recognize the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi and the Miami, who have cared for this place and its resources for many generations and continue to do so today. With deep gratitude, we recognize our Native siblings and their cultures within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work. So the format for our program this afternoon is threefold. It's a little bit different than the usual kind of lectures. First, Dr. Robinette will offer a brief presentation about his work. Next, Dr. Robinette and I will engage in a conversation on some themes in his book, and the remaining time we will open up to the floor for questions and comments from our in-person attendees and those who are joining us via the live stream. Just a reminder that we have some copies of Dr. Robinette's book available for sale in the back, as well as flyers from the publisher with a discount code, and we'll be sure to include a link to the publisher's page for our online viewers. Without further ado, it's my privilege to introduce our guest today. Ryan D. Robinette is Associate Professor of Theology at Boston College. After receiving his PhD from the University of Notre Dame in 2003, he taught at St. Louis University for 9 years before moving to the Boston area. He researches and teaches in the areas of systematic, philosophical, and spiritual theology, with special interests in theology of creation, the doctrine of God, and contemplative practice. The author of numerous academic articles, book chapters, and essays, his first book, Grammars of Resurrection, A Christian Theology of Presence and Absence, published in 2009, received awards from the Catholic Press Association and the College Theology Society. His second book, The Difference Nothing Makes, Creation, Christ, and Contemplation, was published last year by University of Notre Dame Press, and it is the subject of our gathering this afternoon. With an abiding love of the classroom, Professor Robinette teaches a range of undergraduate and graduate level courses and is active in the renewal of the core curriculum at Boston College. I should add that I can personally attest to the excellence of his teaching. While in graduate school, I was a student of Dr. Robinette's, and I was honored to have him serve as my dissertation director, something for which your reward will be great in heaven, I assume. Originally from Anderson, Indiana, that is a native Hoosier among us, he now lives in Needham, Massachusetts with his wife of nearly 30 years, his son Austin. His oldest son, Trevor, is currently a sophomore at Boston College, and their favorite family pastimes include traveling, spontaneous dance parties at home, and playing euchre, which is a classic Midwestern card game for those who are uninitiated in that tradition. So please join me in extending a very warm St. Mary's welcome to Dr. Brian Robinette.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I am curious, does anybody know how to play euchre? A few of you? All right, so you'll probably learn the rules a little bit later. Maybe you will be properly initiated. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you, Professor Horan, for inviting me here. And it's a special honor to be here also with Professor Koblenz. When I first arrived at Boston College, they were doctoral students. I think first and second year doctoral students. And the first time that I ever taught a doctoral seminar was with them in it. And they gave me a run for my money in that seminar. They're extraordinary. They're a dynamic duo, and you are very blessed to have them here in your midst. So thank you, and I look forward to getting to know your students and your colleagues here. Given the nature of this event, a book talk, I intend to flesh out a few key themes of the book in an engaging fashion as I can. And given the audience of this event, a happily mixed one, with plenty of undergraduate students here who may be under the gentle pressure of their professors to attend, I would like to speak from the inside of the book, from its beating heart, its existential guts. There are two lines of questioning that animate this book. And these lines of questioning have haunted me my entire adult life and even portions of my childhood. It's not so much that I have these questions as they seem to have me. Maybe they will strike you as familiar, or maybe the way that I formulate them will seem quite new to you. Either way, I wish to pop a cork in the room. The first question seems straightforward enough until, that is, you really ask it. Why is there anything at all rather than nothing? Why is there anything at all rather than nothing? Or alternatively, why does anything exist? Why is this all just here? Why are you here? And why am I here? How is it that all of this is just happening? And isn't it most strange that you and I, that we are involved in this happening? Isn't it striking to the point of inducing a sense of vertigo, or maybe a surge of unspeakable joy, that all of this is, and that you and I are inseparably in its midst? From whence is all of it coming? And just where is it going? And how might we live more deeply into this coming and going? Okay, so if questions like these don't arrest your mind or stop your heart, then maybe we haven't asked them quite yet. Or maybe they haven't quite landed. In fact, there is something about this question, why is there anything at all rather than nothing, that cannot be fathomed? Our minds reach out for some kind of answer, but are left suspended in wonder. A primal sense of wow or whoa arises within us, as though opening our eyes for the very first time and seeing everything afresh and its stunning there-ness. Are you with me? Now, admittedly, we don't normally perceive reality with this degree of freshness. Our eyes become dimmed. We grow accustomed to things. We need to be practical and move on with our lives. Get an internship, study for midterms. We accumulate habits and take things for granted. We label and categorize. We reify our experience, turning its living, ceaseless flow into a concatenation of things. And bit by bit, we've forgotten how to wonder, how to be surprised, how to be human. Now, I take it that one of theology's basic tasks is to awaken our sense of wonderment and assist us in unclogging our pores of spiritual perception. As the Jewish theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel put it, and I quote, "The surest way to suppress our ability to understand the meaning of God and the importance of worship is to take things for granted. Indifference to the sublime wonder of living is the root of sin." Now, I think that statement reflects a profound understanding of what it means to utter the word God. We typically take this word for granted, as though we know just what it refers to, whether we affirm or deny the existence of God. But Heschel is trying to jolt us out of slumber and rekindle in us a sense of the unconditioned aliveness that is God. Astonishment is the open doorway to theology. A major part of my book is dedicated to just that, exercising a kind of therapy of knowing and desiring to awaken or reawaken a sense of God's vivaciousness. This is one way to account for the term contemplation in the subtitle. So the subtitle is Creation, Christ, Contemplation. A very fine definition of contemplation comes from Richard of St. Victor, an influential 12th century theologian and mystic. And he says the following: contemplation is the free and clear vision of the mind fixed upon the manifestation of wisdom and suspended wonder. I'd like to read that again. Contemplation is the free and clear vision of the mind fixed upon the manifestation of wisdom and suspended wonder. Notice in this summary that contemplation has to do with the liberation of the mind from distraction and prejudice. Vision does not mean seeing visionary phenomena. Rather, it suggests transparency and lucidity. And notice, too, that the reference to mind does not imply thinking. This isn't a rationalism aiming at some sensory object or conceptual problem, which it might grasp and finally resolve. It refers to our deepest capacities for knowing, which, while not excluding problem-based thinking, is more direct and intuitive, more receptive, capacious in character. This point is further suggested by the reference to wisdom and suspended wonder. For whereas the thinking process is typically discursive, meaning moving from this to that, from this to that, inferring this, now concluding that, contemplative knowing arises from wide-eyed wonderment, from beholding reality as it gives itself, rather than seizing it. This is a subtler power of knowing that senses an immediate rapport with creation in its wholeness and living texture. Contemplative knowing is not incompatible with the hard work of solving problems or getting things done or studying for midterms. But contemplative knowing draws from dimensions that run deeper than discursive thought. As Thomas Merton puts it in his New Seeds of Contemplation, and perhaps you've heard of Thomas Merton, you should, at least from Professor Horan. Merton writes, contemplation is a sudden gift of awareness, an awakening to the real with all that is real, a vivid awareness of infinite being at the roots of our own limited being. Now, with this sense of contemplative wonderment in mind, let me touch upon another major feature of the book, which is to explore the character of creation. And this is where the main title comes into focus, The Difference Nothing Makes. It is a playful title that invokes a key doctrinal claim in Christian theology, namely that creation is from nothing, creatio ex nihilo. While seemingly abstract, this formulation is key to the understanding, to the Christian understanding of the God-world relation. First articulated in the 2nd and 3rd centuries with broad consensus among Christian theologians, the doctrine means to affirm that God's creative act is radically free. In contrast to a world picture in which God molds form from pre-existing matter or imposes order upon primordial chaos through force, the Christian understanding is that God summons forth all things with a creative love that is not conditioned by anything at all. God is not like a regional deity or a demiurge who works within pre-given constraints. And neither is there any external reason or ulterior motive for God's creative act. God is not compelled by any lack, by loneliness, or an inner agitation to give being to that which is other than God. The world does not have to be at all, and yet it is from nothing, which is to say, out of the sheer gratuity of God, upon whom all things continuously depend for their existence. This further implies that creation is primordially good. So, in contrast to any world picture that imagines the world as separated from God, perhaps by virtue of its finitude or materiality, creation from nothing affirms the original goodness of the world, despite the dysfunction we generate within it. More on that in a moment. The doctrine declares that conditioned reality is the gift of difference, endowed by a loving God who redeems and promises to transfigure the whole of creation for its eternal fulfillment in God. Finitude is not a barrier to God, as certain dualistic pictures of the God-world relation suppose, but the very means by which creatures are united with God. This is a highly condensed summary of a doctrine with explosive significance, but I hope you can begin to see how it functions like a core insight that helps shape all Christian speech and imagination. By affirming creation as utterly dependent upon God for its existence, a fundamental difference between God and creation is articulated that highlights for us their profound intimacy. The difference is about intimacy. God and creation are not rivals. God and creation do not occupy and compete on the same plane. Though it might be natural for us to imagine God as a being among other beings, perhaps a very big or supreme being who sets all things in motion and who subsequently exercises control over them. Thinking this way only situates God within a larger frame of references and nexus of causes. God would then become a function within the world, a causal link within a chain of events, rather than the inexhaustible source and ground of the world. No, God is at once radically transcendent to the world as its creator, and yet God is not set apart from the world in any oppositional manner, as though occupying some imaginably distant space. God's otherness is the inmost factor of our lives. To paraphrase St. Augustine, God is nearer to us than we are to ourselves, present to all creatures as their abiding source and ground. This relation between transcendence and immanence might seem like a contradiction to binary thinking, but it is in fact a fruitful paradox that opens our minds and hearts to contemplative wisdom. We just have to allow that. God is not really absent from us, though we can often feel absent from God. But as we sink into the realization that God is the source and ground of our lives, then we can grow in the recognition of our inviolable dignity as creatures. I am and you are because God is God. God is Godding. Now, I mentioned that there were two lines of questioning that animate this book. The first being, why is there anything at all rather than nothing? The Christian response to this question does not eliminate our astonishment but deepens and gives it a distinctive cast. At the very least, we have to say that all things exist by way of God's free self-gift, ex nihilo, and as a summons to participate in God's own unconditioned life. But we can and really must say more. So my second line of questioning goes something like this. Where does human dysfunction come from? From whence sin? Now, notice that this question is more sharply focused than the broader question, why is there evil and suffering in the world? Well, I'm interested in those questions too, but they don't hold my attention the way human conflict does. I want to know why we harm one another. Where does rivalry come from? Why, if creaturely life is so precarious and precious, do we fight one another? Why do we make life hard on each other and ourselves? Perhaps another way to put it is this: why doesn't love prevail? What blocks the recognition that self and other are interdependent and of inviolable worth? What impedes our capacities for love, and how may we become free from those impediments? You with me on this question? Now, if you are expecting me to produce a tidy answer in the few minutes I have left in this talk, I am sorry to disappoint you. It is hard enough to formulate the questions well. But a major part of the book is dedicated to exploring this question. And I do so with the help of a range of thinkers deeply inspired by Scripture and the Gospels in particular. One way to characterize the central dynamic involved is to say that there is a glitch in the background of how we desire and how we construct our tenuous identities. We often operate with the prevailing assumption that self and other are contrastive realities, when in fact we are profoundly interdependent. We imagine ourselves as the sovereign authors of our desires and our lives, when in fact we borrow desires from one another, mirroring them back and forth in a reciprocal fashion. Because we are so adept at imitating one another, so interwoven through our shared desires, we readily collide with one another when attempting to obtain our desires. Like two children grasping at the same toy or object of desire, because each has borrowed the desire from the other, we continually find ourselves struggling with others for goods we imagine as scarce. These goods are not just toys. They can be the desire for prestige and recognition, for political sovereignty, for social belonging, for cultural goods. In other words, our extraordinary capacities to imitate one another, capacities which are good, in fact, insofar as they make us human. These capacities are involved as we fall over and over into conflict with one another. And perhaps this can come out a little bit more clearly in the Q&A. We want what the other wants. And with this shared wanting comes all manner of entanglement and struggle, ranging from envy, resentment, anger, and exclusionary violence. Because we are so drawn towards one another in the way we desire, we are constantly tempted to retreat into constructions of self that we imagine are comprehensible and durable, and set off from the other, with whom we are nevertheless in relation. We curve in upon ourselves, grasp at a reified sense of self that we struggle to prop up and defend, but always at the expense of a more basic truth. There is no separate self. Now, if it is appropriate to make some distinction between self and other, or between this thing and that thing, The problem is that we constantly mistake these conventional distinctions for deeper realities. Such is the essence of reification, this term that I've used, reification, to thingify or to freeze something. And it occurs on many scales in human relations, ranging from the interpersonal to the construction of in-groups that promise to stabilize our imagined identities in contrast with out-groups that would appear to threaten them. That is, the clinging to self readily assumes collective, not just individualized forms, and become entrenched as social, institutional, and cultural habits. Conflict, violence, or just plain indifference to others becomes sedimented in our history through such structures, only to replicate themselves at higher levels of organization. That is, they become systemic. Now, that is quite the compact summary, I realize, but perhaps it is sufficient to give some sense of the diagnostic element of the book, which aims to better understand the dynamics of human desire and the way we block and distort the gift of creation. From a Christian perspective, this diagnosis, to the extent it is helpful, is really an invitation to explore how the person of Christ reveals to us who God really is, while revealing to us who we really are. This revelation is simultaneous. And what is revealed in Christ is a way of desiring that is not built upon rivalry or conflict, but loving communion. The Gospels do not ultimately propose to us a theory about human desire, but they show us a way of human desire that relates freely, creatively, and lovingly with one another and with God. It is stunning how prominent the theme of imitation is in the New Testament. Imitation here does not mean mimicry, like I see what you do and I copy. It means sharing desires, borrowing desires, or inhabiting the desires of others. And so at the Gospels, it means desiring in the way Christ desires, who himself desires according to the one he calls his Father. In the person of Christ, the God of unconditioned generosity enters our humanity fully, showing us how to be human, even in the midst of our sin and brokenness. Indeed, what is so remarkable is that God in Christ plunges into the depths of the human condition with a love so tenacious and free as to absorb our sin and brokenness, to redeem us from it, and reopen our suffocating self-enclosures to the infinite life that is God. We see this opening up throughout the whole of Jesus' ministry, and we see it again in the way he goes to his death with freedom and love. And we see it maximally when, having been crucified by our sin and brokenness, he returns to us as the risen Christ to offer us healing, forgiveness, and a promise of eternal life with each other in God. And so, for all the perplexities that the problem of sin and human dysfunction raises for us, perplexities that still weigh heavily upon us, the Christian has at least this to say, that the God who gives us to be from nothing and who loves us into being is the same God who has become human with us and for us, is the same God who shares our creaturely condition out of unfathomable love in order to redeem and transfigure our humanity. Creation and incarnation are two differentiated aspects of the same dynamic process. And this is the difference nothing makes. Thank you.
Okay, got to make sure this is on. Well, thank you very much. I have to say, as somebody who's read the book and has been somewhat familiar with your thinking on some of these themes for a while, I have to say I'm incredibly impressed at how in 20 minutes you're able to condense so many things. So congratulations on that front. Just a reminder to our folks in the audience here and those who are joining us via live stream. I'm going to be engaging Professor Robinette for a little bit in conversation, but then the floor is yours. So if you have ideas, questions, maybe connections that you're making from your own study or that you want to hear more from Professor Robinette, make sure to take note. We'll be coming around with a microphone. But to get things started, I have so many questions. We could go on for a couple hours, but I won't do that. I'll save us that trouble. I think one of the last things that you talked about in your prepared remarks in bringing together the importance of the contingency of creation, creatio ex nihilo, thinking again about contemplation and how that's connected, the role of mimetic rivalry, and then the importance of Christ as salvific and as the answer, reminded me of something that you talk about and borrow from Edward Skillebeck's. And I want to hear maybe a little bit more about this because I'm not as familiar with the idea. And it's a very curious phrase, an evocative idea that he uses and that you engage. Basically, that Christ can be understood to be concentrated creation. So could you say a little bit about how you understand that concept and how it fits into some of this thinking?
Yeah, sure. So Edward Skillebeck's a Dutch Catholic theologian who wrote about many topics, but as he described the contours of all of his work, he always came back to this theme of creation, that he was always really writing about the theme of creation. And when he says that Christ is concentrated creation, what he really means is that Christ is what creation is meant to be, what it should be, what it is in the process of becoming, even in the midst of the unfinished character of creation. So it's a concentration of creation in terms of crystallizing the heart of creation, but it is a concentration that shows up in an unfinished world and also a world that is assailed with brokenness, woundedness, sin in a particular way. I think there's one other thing about that phrase, though he doesn't talk about it as much as maybe I think he should, but the Christian tradition understands that it's not just that Christ appears in creation as concentrated creation, but creation comes to be through Christ. So when we speak of the creative act, God's creative act as occurring in and through the eternal word of God, what we really mean is that the patterning of creation has as its ultimate paradigm the eternal self-expression of God as the Son. So there is a pre-creational dimension to this, as well as the appearance of creation within the contingent history of it.
The way you summarize that has me thinking about a particular aspect of Christology that's near and dear to my heart, which is the school of supralapsarian Christology, about the reason for the incarnation. Why did God become human, right? After affirming that God became human in Christ. And I'm thinking about, you mentioned Thomas Merton, so I can use him as an example. The end, you quote from the beginning of New Seeds of Contemplation and helping to define and flesh out the meaning of contemplation. At the end, he plays with this idea of creation in Christ, calls it the general dance, and says that creation was made in order that God may enter into it. Do you agree? Do you have thoughts about that?
I have a few. And I do agree. I think that we're on the same page.
Then we can keep talking.
It's, of course, a tremendous limitation of Christian imagination to say that Christ appears in our world primarily by way of fixing some kind of problem, that there is brokenness, that there is sin, that there must be some fix, some resolution to that. There's a sense in which that is, of course, quite appropriate. We speak of the redemptive character of the Christ event. So Jesus's life, his death, and his resurrection is not only revealing who God is, but also revealing who God is in the context of sin, of brokenness. And so therefore, that revelation shows up in particular ways and is not just about revelation as a distribution of information, but an enactment in a life that means to bring about a transformation of human life. So there's a totally appropriate way in which we would speak of the Christ event in terms of redemption. But a profounder understanding has it that the very act of creation itself is a way in which God is endowing existence to that which is other than God, but precisely for union with God. And so therefore we could speak of the motive or the reason for creation as being this union. And the greatest pitch of that in Christian understanding is the incarnation. So creation isn't just a backdrop for other things to occur, but is actually the medium through which God is becoming human or creaturely with us. And this is not something like a second thought on God's part, but part of the very intrinsic meaning of creation. So like you, I side with that part of the Christian theological tradition that sees the incarnation as really the purpose of creation rather than some sort of answer to some dysfunction that appears within it.
And it seems to me that that fits as well with the way you use Girard in the third part of the book in particular, but in a lot of your work and in a lot of ways that people engage his thinking about, as you said, with that second line of questioning, how did we get here? Why do we do this to one another? If creation is good, if our preciousness and precarity is something to be celebrated and a gift, then why the harm, right? Before switching gears, maybe to talk a bit more about Girard and staying on the theme of Christ's explicitly, I'm curious. You didn't as much in your prepared remarks this evening, but in the book, you kind of hearken back to its predecessor and your extensive work on the doctrine of resurrection. And I'm just wondering how you see the relationship between these two projects. Your first book on resurrection, a lot of the same figures reappear: Rahner, Skillebeck, so forth. It's the who's who of theological heft. But how do you personally, maybe as you were working on this project, as you continue to think about it, what are the connections there?
Yeah, so the first book, Grammars of Resurrection, the last part of it really deals with the themes of creation. And the itinerary of that book was really meant to arrive at a place where we would say, from a Christian point of view, from within Christian imagination, within Christian faith, we come to really understand what creation is through the resurrection. In other words, somewhat like if you have a moment of reveal within a movie or a novel in which the beginning makes sense, or at least comes into view precisely through this late development, so too is it the case that Christians understand what creation is, what it's about, retrospectively from what is revealed in the resurrection. And I'll try to speak a little bit more concretely about this. The thing about the resurrection is that subsequent to a brutal murder, a crucifixion, as a result of a collusion of various kinds of forces, political forces, of course, interpersonal dynamics, some profound resistance or negation resulting in the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. The fundamental event of Christian faith is, of course, what happens after that. The appearance or the showing up of a crucified victim, risen, who is vindicated. The entire apparatus surrounding his crucifixion judged to be a sham, and an offer of shalom, or peace and forgiveness, in the midst. This is the defining Christian experience. And so from disaster, or from some kind of nihil, some nothing, appears something so gratuitous, so beyond the expectations of those who were the recipients of it. And it recast what those earliest Christians or earliest followers of Jesus understood about Jesus. And subsequently, the whole history of Israel, and subsequently the whole history of creation itself. In other words, from this moment, from this aperture, comes a profoundly new sense of who God is, and therefore what the destiny of creation is, even in the midst of what looks to be the utter squelching of creation. And so it's from this very explosive experience and insight, and we can see this in the patterning of the Gospels themselves, where the whole of creation really gets recast in light of this experience. So from the end, or from this eschatological rupture within history, comes a perception of what creation is, or this protological perspective. These are just fancy terms to mean the end or the beginning of things. So as I reached the end of that book, I was really primed to want to do a text on the theology of creation. So I really see the two books in a way as continuous, as an unfolding long-form series of thoughts about this. And so I bring the resurrection, the theme of resurrection, up at various junctures within this particular text, although I'm more interested in the protological questions.
And maybe that's a good way to circle back to one of those, the first line of questioning that you introduced us to as the impetus for this project. So I have many more questions, but I want to make sure we have time for everybody else. So the last question is, in thinking about what I sometimes think of as the two-sided coin of protology and eschatology, of creation and salvation, one of the earliest Christian theologians who talk about that is one that you rely on to lift up the kind of earliest and most kind of substantive thinking in the Christian tradition around the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, Irenaeus of Lyon. And around the same time in the book, fairly early on, when you're talking about making a case, a kind of apologia, because there are naysayers against which you are, I think, correctly responding. You say something very interesting in the beginning of your second chapter. You say, and I quote, "The doctrine of creatio ex nihilo is, among other things, an invitation to contemplation." I think you touched on this a bit in your prepared remarks, but I think there might be some Christians, including some folks, maybe even in this audience, who might scratch their heads in response to that statement. So I might ask you, like, how do you see the doctrine as an invitation to contemplation?
Well, sort of the way I was sketching it out at the beginning of this talk. The affirmation creation comes from nothing is a technical phrase, really. I mean, it appears to do a certain kind of technical work. But even though it does that, it has a certain way of arresting the mind. Where is all of this coming from? I don't know whether you have had those moments, like maybe at 3 o'clock in the morning, or maybe you've had a couple of them since you've been parked here for this event, but where you just are shocked by the fact that all of this, that you exist. This is happening. We take it for granted. Why should we? Why is this happening? Why are we here? Why is this unfolding? And why am I conscious? And why are you conscious? And why am I capable of asking these questions? It can stop your heart. I think that the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo is doing something similar. It's asking us to become awakened newly, as though for the first time, of the sheer fact that we exist. And I think that this is an invitation to contemplation, because contemplation might be described as the intervening into certain habits of the mind. Habits where we take things for granted. We just kind of run things according to certain scripts. certain programs, certain labels, categories. When we do this, and at some point, it's a functional good for us to be able to do this. We can't just spend our whole lives gobsmacked all the time. We have to get things done. We have to be engaged in various practical ways. But this has the tendency to deaden us. And so contemplation is, among other things, a suspension of these automaticities of mind or heart to open us up to the freshness of things. And there are particular kinds of practices that we can engage in. It doesn't mean engaging in a sort of intellectual activity that I'm doing now. It also means certain practices of silence or being in certain sacred spaces when we are, when we feel this upsurge of intuition, of the beauty and fragility, the simple suchness of our being here. Contemplation, or a contemplative way, means becoming ever more open to this recognition and being transformed by it, so that when we do engage in the various activities of our lives, our relationships, our practical commitments, that we're doing so with the sense of the inviolable dignity of being creaturely. I think we experience one another differently as a result. We begin to perceive something of the miracle that we really are. I wonder if I'll ask you a quick question, if I may, and then I know we'll kick it out to the audience. But I wonder if you can give a brief report of what Thomas Merton experienced at the corner of 4th and Walnut when he had this sort of flash of intuition in which he began to see people as so full of dignity as to almost wish to worship them. You must remember the line.
I do. It's like they were walking around shining like the sun. So in March of 1958, this American Trappist monk who lived in a monastery outside Louisville, Kentucky, so about 4 hours from here, make a road trip, was out running some errands in downtown Louisville and was standing at the intersection of 4th and Walnut streets, which are now today 4th and Muhammad Ali. The street was renamed after another son of Louisville, Muhammad Ali. And Merton has this, for lack of a better word, mystical experience, by which I mean exactly what Professor Robinette was saying, a kind of clarity of sight and of thought and of heart, where up until this point, especially in the Catholic tradition, Catholic religious tradition, he understood his vocation to be one of separateness. You know, priests and nuns and monks and religious are different from ordinary Christians. They live a different life. They live apart. And he had this sort of kind of like the unveiling, a sort of, sense of truth recognition that he was connected to and united with everybody. In fact, in your remarks earlier, you had this line too about the function of contemplation and the sort of beauty of the implications of ex nihilo being that we are all interdependent. We don't live as isolated monads or individuals. And so Merton, recognizing this, says basically in a very poetic way that it was as if everybody was walking around like the sun. And if only we could see each other this way, there would be no more violence. There would be no more war. There would be no more kind of disagreement and strife, which is a kind of Girardian Christological unveiling, unfolding. If you want to read more about that or see the full quote, I can direct you to that afterwards. But always love a good Thomas Merton reference. Thank you for that. Okay, Dr. Fetter has a microphone in the back. So for the folks in the room, if you raise your hand if you have a question or comment for Professor Robinette, and for those online, feel free to put that in the Q&A and we will pass that along.
Okay, so after your own reflection on human dysfunction, do you think that evil is necessary to help us better know and understand the good in life and goodness in God?
No, I don't. Evil, I don't think, is necessary in any sense. I take your question. Let me make sure I understand your question. Your question is, given the nature of violent expulsion. Is that what you said? Do we need something like that in order to be educated in some way to know what good is? Yeah. Yes, I don't think so. Which is not to say that struggle or resistance or ambiguity are evil either. But you use the word evil, and I would just want to separate that word out and not to endow any sense of necessity with it. That would result in a certain picture of the world where good and evil are something like co-eternal principles, both necessary and in some way. And so the Christian vision would not lead to something like that. But that's not to say that struggle or suffering or ambiguity are evil necessarily. And that, in fact, through resistance or ambiguity or the difficulty of growth can come great good, but I would not call that evil. I would want to distinguish evil from that. Is that okay? Good.
So you use the word intimate to describe the relationship between God and creation, correct? Was that what it was between? So I was wondering, like, were you using that because because God didn't have to create us, or I wanted to know, like, why use the word intimate to describe that relationship?
Yeah. Well, I could use other words. I could use words like nearness or presence. But I use this because the term transcendence, or to speak of otherness, sounds like distance. Intimacy has a quality of affect for us. When we say something is intimate, we say that we feel it or it's near. It has a certain kind of warmth, maybe even a kindness or gentleness to it. And I really think it's important that when we talk about the transcendence of God or the otherness of God, that this doesn't strike us only as being something remote, which of course, in a way, that's also true. I mean, God as unconditioned mystery, ungraspable, beyond our ability to fathom, and a sense of awesomeness that comes from that, right? The sense of the awesomeness, and maybe even a little bit of fear. Is sort of a fear of the unbounded or of the unconditioned. And so we, in the face of that, we kind of recoil a little bit, or we kind of, grasp it at self to try to obtain some degree of security or identity. But when we use the term intimacy with respect to God, or when I do so, I want to say that both of these things are true, that God is that which induces us in a sense of immensity, but it's also profoundly safe, utterly reliable, utterly trustworthy. And this is something that can be sensed by us in various ways, but certainly through prayer and contemplative practice allows us, among other things, to relax into that immensity and to feel safe, to be held, and to know that it is actually a loving kindness rather than just simply a distant, commanding sort of agency.
So I really liked how you described, like, one of theology's greatest tasks was like to teach how to wonder, kind of. You said something along those lines, which I thought was cool. So I was wondering, like, how, or if that's been like a motivator for you in your work, just in general in your writing or whatever, and like how so? Like, how has that motivated you as a theologian?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little kid. I still I still feel like a little kid most of the time, quite honestly. I have this like a little bit of a giddy sense about things. Just a little bit excited about things. I can't really quite believe this is happening. I feel that very often, actually. Of course, there are things that I do in my life that might deaden that sense. You know, you go through suffering, you go through perplexity, you get into routine, and that can deaden. So you have to engage in various kinds of practices to have yourself revivified. But wonderment through a sense of feeling profoundly open to new experience and to people, not recoiling from them, but a sense of welcome, is a dominant feature of my life, and it's something that I think actually is infectious. It's something that we can, in a way, teach or share with one another, and it does show up in a lot of my work as a professor in a classroom. By the way, in which I might want to elicit questions from students or to express some degree of excitement for what it is that we're actually doing, and that's not feigned excitement, you know, for me.
Hi. I apologize also if you've already kind of like talked about my question or answered it, but I liked how you kind of took a philosophical perspective in the beginning of your talk about like not being able to perceive life with a freshness like or a clear lens, I guess. But currently in Professor Copeland's class, you're talking about like before Christ and after Christ and kind of how people viewed God. And my question in relation to the freshness of viewing life would be, do you feel as if people who followed God now, not I guess not now, but then had a freshness of what God was supposed to be after the coming of Christ and like death and resurrection?
Could you repeat that last part?
Yes, sorry, I'm really nervous. But so before and after Christ, do you think that people who believed in God and experienced all of those different things had a fresh view of what God was after the coming and death of Christ?
Yes, I believe I understand your question. It's a very good question. I would want to say two things simultaneously. I would the first is more of a caution, not to you, but maybe a caution to anyone who would think along these lines. I think that we want to avoid imagining that somehow after Christ there's been such a fresh perspective upon God that everything that was available to be perceived before is sort of old hat. In other words, the danger there is to have such an emphasis upon the New Testament, for instance, and the Gospels, that everything prior to that seems something like prologue, like we were just sort of waiting to get to this point. And I think that diminishes the depth and riches of certainly of the Jewish tradition, but also other traditions that had not been touched by Christianity and may still not be very much. So I think that there are depths and riches in other traditions and other contexts that allow for this freshness that has something comparable to what we could say is present in Christ. However, I do think that there is something very potent and very important, very particular about what happens in the Gospels and what shows up in the life, death, and resurrection of Christ that really stands out and needs to continue to be a part of the conversation with other religious traditions without diminishing them in any way. And I think one of the things to point to immediately is the event of resurrection that I was talking about, where after a brutal execution, there is an interruption into the sense of the totality of death and violence when it seems to have had the last word. There is a breakthrough, an initiative on the part of God that is irreducible to anything that had been is prior to that, and which opens up for us a perspective and an experience and a way of relating to God that gives us a certain degree of confidence in terms of the ultimate yes of creation and the ultimate yes of God, even in the midst of that. That I do think is very particular and very powerful, and maybe even enhances everything else that it might come into contact with, rather than in some way opposing it. It's a great question. Did I answer your question in a way?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Thank you for a wonderful talk there. I am curious, when we're talking about contemplation, if you have any kind of pragmatic insight as to how we can offer contemplation to the masses, because it feels like, at least to me, as I engage with these new ideas of contemplation and try to actually engage the practice itself, it's easy to do it here, where we're both enjoying a seat in an ornate, beautiful room in an academic building in a scholarly context. But that when I go to church on Sunday, the reality is most of my peers simply don't have the opportunity. And perhaps they're not engaging in this sense of awe and wonder, not because they're so, I think the word you used was accustomed, taking life for granted, but because they don't know it's available. That when you say words like Skillabex or Merton or ex nihilo or eschatology, it's there and gone. But the beauty of the Christian faith is that we share it as a community, that this isn't some esoteric topic that can't be given. So, like, in terms of accessibility, what are you thinking?
Yes. Perfect question. I think the real risk in talking about contemplation is that it seems like a rarefied practice that is really only appropriate for certain kinds of persons or circumstances, usually of a leisurely sort. And all of that presupposes certain kinds of advantages, certain kinds of supports that don't often exist for lots of people. So in other words, it can come across as fairly elitist. And of course, there are ways in which the cultivation of contemplation or contemplative practices are appropriately cultivated in context of some kind of separation. That we do need that. And it's good that there are communities or certain persons who are committed to that for the benefit of everyone else. I'm thinking of retreats and monastic contexts and things of that sort. So we should be very, very grateful for that. But to your point, I think that the primary way to think about contemplation, that it would the risk is that it would be locked away from this common access that we actually need to cultivate. So I think that there has one way I would put that is I would say the past 50 or 60 years, especially, there has been, to use a phrase of a theologian, contemplation has jumped the monastery walls. There's been something of like a democratization of contemplative practices that we find in lots of different contexts. So you may be aware of, say, mindfulness practices. I think probably most in this room are aware of some mindfulness practices that show up in all kinds of contexts, from prisons to grade schools to hospitals to workplaces. And I think that this is part of a growing movement or a certain kind of restlessness for these kinds of practices to become more available, not just in particular places where they have been traditionally available, but more broadly distributed in the everyday, in our everyday lives, in our everyday spaces. I think that a major gift on the part of Christian practitioners and who are interested in contemplation and contemplative practices. A major gift would be to make these kinds of practices more broadly known, more accessible, and also capable of being practiced in short bits and bytes. And there really are ways to do this so that in discrete moments in between activities or prior to eating or to certain kinds of support groups in a workplace, that these are the sorts of contexts that this kind of practice needs to become better known. And it sounds like you have some experience with this as well, or at least some sense for what. That's right. So anyway, thank you for your question. I think about that a lot, and it's even though it still represents a rarefied place in terms of the classroom, the classroom is a place where I also introduce students to these kinds of practices so that they can carry them out in their own lives when they're not at college and having to do this as part of their curriculum.
Well, before we go, just a few announcements. First, a note of gratitude to Dr. Julia Fetter and to Miss Rebecca Holm from the Center for the Study of Spirituality, who've helped make this happen. Thanks as well to all of you who've taken the time to be here in person or via our live stream. I have another announcement that this Friday evening at 7 o'clock, so it's March 8th at 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, you're invited to join us for a live webinar with Dr. Judith Herman of Harvard University, who will be speaking about her latest book, Truth and Repair, How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice. That event is being sponsored by the Center for the Study of Spirituality. It's open to the public, and to register for the live stream, go to stmarys.edu/spirituality. And last but not least, please join me in thanking Dr. Brian Robinette for this wonderful event.